Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of About Abortion. Now that we're a few weeks in to the new regime of the Labour government, I wanted to offer something of an election reflection. Now that the dust has settled, I think it's important that we look back and see not only what's happened in the nation, but in particular, and this is what I want to focus on today, what all this has revealed about the church. In other episodes, we're looking more at what this will mean for the nation, for legislation that's coming up, the composition of parliament, and so on. We're looking at that elsewhere. But today, I want to consider what's been revealed to us about ourselves, about the church, in terms of our conduct and our thinking in the run up to the election. As I mentioned before on this channel, the Sunday before the election, we were praying earnestly that God would have mercy on our nation and spare us a Labour government. The Sunday after the results came through, we of course accepted from the Lord's hand what he has done. God is the one who exalts a man and who humbles a man. All the shields on earth belong to him, and he is the one who decides and appoints our rulers. And so we can say, certainly at one level, of course, God has done as he has seen fit. No doubt there is an element of judgment there on our nation, and indeed I would say on the church, because we helped to get this government in place. But really what I would look at is not what this means moving forwards at a political level as such, but rather what's this revealed to us about the church? And in this episode, I want to put it to you that what this has revealed, amongst other things, is exactly as Harry Blamire said just over 60 years ago in his book called The Christian Mind. What this has revealed once again is that there is no Christian mind. There is no Christian mind. I want to demonstrate that this is the case, and I want to think about why this is the case. I think one thing we've seen beyond any shadow of a doubt in the run-up to the election and what Christians were saying, Christian publications, Christian voices, leaders and so on, is that there was a kind of chaos going on. Multiple mutually exclusive claims being made all the time by Christians in the name of Christ, claims that cannot be reconciled. And in a sense, in and of itself, that's not necessarily surprising. Christians aren't always going to agree on everything, and we need to have those conversations. But I think really the disturbing thing about this chaos is just how comfortable we were with it. And indeed, we wanted to claim that there could be a plurality of mutually exclusive views, and they're all somehow equally valid and equally Christian. And that simply doesn't make sense. Let me just draw your attention to a series of articles written just before the election in Evangelicals Now, one of the leading evangelical newspapers in the country. And I think this really demonstrates the chaos I'm talking about. So the editorial talked about as we decide who to vote for. So it wasn't about discerning. It wasn't discerning what's the will of God, what's God saying, what's going on, what is the Christian answer, but rather as each one of us decides for ourselves who to vote for, more in the realm of personal preference, a subjective issue rather than something that's objective, where there are rights and there are wrongs. And the paper went on to make this claim, and this is common across churches, publications, conferences, and so on, ministries. EN says of itself, it does not do party politics. It stands where you'd expect on topics, such as life issues and so on, and these are important in how we vote, but it doesn't do party politics. Now, this model of political neutrality has become so strained. In 1930s, 1940s Germany, could you really say, well, we are pro-Jew, of course, as Christians, but we don't take a view on which party you should or shouldn't support? As long as you're pro-Jew, it's fine to support the Nazi party. That's a contradiction in terms. And the thing is, we've got the same thing going on today. You can't, for example, say you care for the unborn child and yet vote for a party that's going to make things even worse for the unborn child. It just doesn't make sense. You can't hold those two things simultaneously. And yet this has become the sort of default accepted position of the evangelical world in this country. The paper then goes on to publish an article from almost all of the major political parties, and each of them saying why their approach to politics is the Christian or a Christian approach to politics. Again, they can't all be right, because these parties have mutually exclusive political philosophies and policies. So, for example, there was I thought quite a winsome piece by Burroughs for one could say a more idealized Christian vision of conservatism than is actually seen in the Conservative Party today. But it was a cogent case for that political philosophy. And then, of course, you have Maskell coming in with a pitch for Labour, which is contradictory to that in terms of economy and in terms of other issues. They can't both be right. One of the articles actually said, regardless of your political philosophy, and there are many that are compatible with Christianity. That doesn't make any sense. You can't have mutually exclusive philosophies that are compatible with Christianity. But this was written by the Green representative. It went on to say, it is impossible to come up with long-term solutions to any of the other problems our society faces unless we put dealing with climate and oil at the heart of our political agenda. So this idea that we can sort of dip in and out of neutrality, it doesn't matter what your political philosophy is, so long as you agree with mine, so long as we all agree that climate and oil are the chief problems and we have to solve those before we can solve any other problem. That is a highly defined political philosophy and stance to take. It's not neutral, it's not universal, and indeed I would say it's deeply misguided. In fact, when you put climate and oil at the heart, when you put a particular conception of the problem of climate change and the proposed solution, it's very easy for human beings to get trampled underfoot. Indeed, I've stood outside a Christian justice conference and had someone say to me that they were not wanting to address the problem of abortion at all because, well, the world is burning and so we don't need any more babies. And so sometimes it is precisely against the interests of, for example, the unborn child that certain issues are pitched. So the idea that all of these are equally Christian should be obviously insane. They can't all be equally Christian. They contradict one another. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that just now, other than to mention one local example and one particular outworking of that. One of the churches local to where we live encouraged everyone in their church to put justice for the vulnerable at the heart of their vote. Very good. But then they said, now it's up to you to decide which party does that. Off you go, each to your own. And this may sound like it's empowering, it's getting people to think for themselves and pray for themselves, and it's not being a heavy shepherd who's sort of telling you what to do and all that kind of thing. But the reality is, it buys into this idea, this totally discredited idea that all roads lead to Rome. Now, when it comes to religious faith more directly, Christians reject that. We don't say that God is like an elephant and, we're all feeling the elephant from a different side. So one says it's a trunk, one says it's a tail, and so on. And, we're all touching the same thing, just got different perspectives. We reject that as Christians because Christ has revealed God to us definitively. And so we reject the idea that all roads lead to God. And yet, how is it we've adopted this idea, all roads lead to justice? It doesn't make sense. For example, let's say a congregant in this church said, okay, well, the particular group that I want to stand up for is women. I want to stand up for women's welfare and rights and so on. The Labour Party can't even tell you what a woman is. So how can they be the party to elevate the welfare of women? Now, that should be obvious, but this church and other churches don't want to say the obvious, that if a party can't define what a woman is, it's not the party for women. Again, Labour will say they're the party for the vulnerable, and yet they despise the unborn child, and they're also increasingly despising the elderly and the infirm with incoming assisted suicide votes and so on. So this neutrality, and we've talked about this a bit before on this channel, but this neutrality is so strained. It is obviously defunct, this model that we can just be politically neutral as long as people's attitudes are, well, I'm voting for the right reasons. All parties are not equal. All roads do not lead to justice. It is indefensible, even from an a priori standpoint, that all parties' policies, decisions should be equally Christian, but even more so when we actually look at the facts and we look at the policies. But the thing I want to focus on here is not only do we tolerate this insanity, this perpetual self-contradiction within the church, the body of Christ, we actually encourage it. We actually like it this way. I'm reminded of Jeremiah 5:31. The prophets prophesy falsely, they prophesy lies, and my people like it like this. They love it this way. We actually imbibe this indefensible insanity that Christians can vote in mutually opposing directions, and that's all fine. We actually encourage it. We celebrate it. We preach it. It doesn't make sense. And I want to make the case that there's a reason for our insanity here. It's not just by chance that we've got to this point where we're saying stuff that's quite obviously self-contradictory and therefore false. There is a reason for it. The men of Issachar were men who understood the times and knew what to do. Where are the men of Issachar today? Well, the truth is, we don't want the men of Issachar. We don't want them. We don't want to hear from people who claim that they understand the times and they know what to do. We're much more comfortable with surrounding ourselves with false prophets who tell us, hey, you simply do what's right for you. Do what's best in your own eyes. And instead of putting the prophets of Baal to death, we ordain them into the Church of England, and instead we turn on the men of Issachar and put them to death. They're the baddies. They're the bigots. Because we don't want to hear that the living God has a will and a way, and we are either working with him or against him in that regard. We don't want to hear that. We want to do our own thing. The truth is, we don't want men of Issachar. We want Judges 21. We want there was no king in those days and everyone just did what was right in their own eyes. We want no leadership. There was no king, and we want no moral direction. I make up my own mind. It's for me to decide, according to my own values and self-expression, the right path for me. So we're actually resistant to finding answers, to finding direction, moral clarity. We're resistant. We don't want to admit that there is an answer, and we have to find out. And if my neighbor thinks differently from me, at least one of us is wrong. We don't want men of Issachar. We want Judges 21. Now, of course, we dress this up in Christian garb. We have ways of making it sound Christian, such as the charge that anyone who comes with a claim like this party is ungodly, a Christian should not vote for it. We say that they are binding the conscience. That's our accusation. We say they're binding the conscience. And as Christians, we do need to be careful that we don't bind the conscience wrongly. But when we look at this charge of binding the conscience, we see that it is often inconsistently applied. And the fact that it's inconsistently applied tells us something. It tells us it's not really about binding the conscience. There's something else at play here. So, for example, some years back now, when the so-called vaccine came out for COVID-19, the jab, we took a clear stance that chiefly because of the relationship between the jab and aborted babies, a fetal cell line, because of that connection, because of the involvement of the abortion industry in creating such products, we took a stance against that. And we said Christians should not get the vaccine. Now, there was a real pile-on as pastors and church leaders and whoever else said, oh, this guy's binding people's consciences. We mustn't bind the conscience. We've got to have a common grace approach to this. And people must feel free. They mustn't feel condemned if they take the vaccine. We mustn't let this guy bind the conscience. And yet it was absolutely fine for people on the other side of the debate to tell people to get the vaccine. Indeed, there were videos of Christian leaders lined up to say, get the jab. There were articles. There was one article that went around by John Ling, which finished with the line, so roll up your sleeve and get the vaccine. Now, was anyone accusing him of binding the conscience? Absolutely not. He was being at least as directive as I was. But because he was on the right side, because he was with the mainstream and so on, no one really batted an eyelid, and no one thought he was in danger of binding the conscience. You know, it's interesting. There are certain issues where just by having a stance, just by doing something that is not the mainstream approach, people jump to the conclusion that you are not only believing that, but condemning others who don't believe that or who don't practice that. Another example is home education. I remember a pastor, lovely guy, good pastor, saying to me that he was unsure about the wisdom of a pastor home educating their children, because then everyone in the church would probably feel obliged to home educate their children, or they might feel judged if they don't. Now, insofar as it goes, there may be something there, but why not apply that the other way? If a pastor sends his children into the local state school, won't everyone feel they have to do that as well? So these things don't tend to cut both ways. It's always the person who's on the fringe or the alternative or the not the in the flow of the cultural hegemony of, you know, left-leaning, so-called progressive mainstream culture. They're the ones who are always accused of binding the conscience, even when they're not saying anything. Just by doing something, they are accused of binding the conscience. It's not consistently applied. When someone preaches about creation care, if they say, look, one outworking of this is we do our recycling, does anyone stand up and say, hey, you're binding my conscience, what if I feel like recycling is not right for me? No, they don't, because it's not controversial and it doesn't get you in trouble. So binding the conscience is something which, whether knowingly or unknowingly, whether deliberately or not, it is being used, almost weaponized as a silencing tool for people who take up and promote a particular idea. And we see the same with other terms like gospel first. We just want to preach the gospel. We want to keep the gospel the main thing. And of course, we want to keep the gospel the main thing, but the gospel does have outworkings. Now, some of those outworkings are uncontroversial in our culture, like recycling, like not being a racist. But other outworkings are controversial, like standing against the baby genocide or standing against gender reassignment, so-called surgery. So the thing is, it's not about whether it's gospel first or not. It's about, are we embracing all the outworkings of the gospel, whether they're controversial or not? It's not consistently applied. No one says we just want to keep the gospel the main thing, therefore we're not going to condemn racism. Everyone condemns racism. When the whole George Floyd thing happened in America, churches over here felt an obligation to come out and write statements and condemn racism, even though no one ever in the last several decades in any church in this country has preached racism or said only white people can be members of the church or whatever. No one said you need to keep the gospel the main thing. No, they all felt they had the space and the need to say that particular thing on racism. Again, terms like divisive. You're being divisive. You're polarizing. Well, every view is divisive. Every view is polarizing because there are people who agree and people who don't. But there are certain issues where you get accused of being on the divisive or the polarizing side of things, even though the other side is just as divisive or polarizing. Think about how people who voted for Brexit were characterized in the media. Well, voting Remain is just as divisive. In fact, there are more people in the country who disagree with you if you vote Remain than if you voted Brexit. climate politics, very divisive. And yet it's only the so-called climate deniers who are accused of being out there and extreme and divisive and whatever. Why? Again, because they're not agreeing with the cultural hegemony. And this is the thing. What's behind this inconsistent application of these charges, binding the conscience or whatever? What's actually driving it? And when there is an inconsistency, I think we always have to sit up and pay attention, because those inconsistencies reveal to us what's really going on. If something is consistently applied, it's likely we really believe it, and that's why we're applying it consistently. But if we're quite pick and choose about how we can apply it, it's likely something else is at play. And what's really going on here in all of this is we have this fear of being a political sore thumb. We don't want to stand out. We don't want to be at odds with the flow of the mainstream culture and politics. We want to fit in. And so we've already decided in advance that anything that would cause that, sticking out like a sore thumb, anything that would cause that is not the Christian response, or at least it's not the only Christian response. We want to stay out of trouble politically. So there's this fear of sticking out politically. So it's a fear of persecution, really. But there's also something slightly different. There's a fear of this implication that I'm not a good or proper or real Christian if I don't agree with you on this particular point. I fear that you're making that accusation, even just by being and doing what you are. It implies something about me that I don't like. It doesn't make me feel good. There's this kind of fragile self-esteem. We could call it a sort of evangelical fragility, where we very quickly take things as a personal affront that actually aren't about us at all. But we make them about us. We take it personally. We think it's about us. I'll give you an example. Again, another good pastor said to me once, he wanted to warn me, and insofar as it goes, I obviously wanted to take from this everything that was valid. But he wanted to warn me that our particular approach to the use of graphic imagery, we believe, biblically and according to the history of social reform, that the use of imagery to expose this injustice of the baby genocide, to show the humanity of the victims, these pictures are necessary. They are justified, and they are necessary. They're effective. We need to use pictures to end this genocide. Now, this pastor said to me, look, don't make that your shibboleth. Don't say to people, look, if you don't agree with us on the pictures, we're not going to work with you, and so on. And there's this sort of idea that's related to that by extrapolation. People will say to us, oh, just because we don't agree with you on the image, on your methods, please don't think we're not pro-life. Please don't think, But that added layer doesn't come from us. We don't lead with that. We don't finish with that. We don't say, and if you don't agree with me, your doctrine is all over the place and you're probably not a proper Christian. But people seem very quick to take it that way. There's this kind of fragility where we take things as a personal criticism, when actually it's just a claim about what actually works for saving babies. And that's what it's about. It's about saving the babies. I'm not trying to make any claim of moral superiority. I'm not trying to make a spiritual judgment on myself or on you. It's just the pictures save lives, and we're trying to save lives. That's what it's about. But so many are quick to take things personally, to think that things pertain to my status as whether I'm saved or not. But actually, it's simply the fact that picture saves lives, and here's the evidence. Obviously, that's the thing that matters. By analogy, imagine if a church didn't have a safeguarding policy, and another church came alongside, or a pastor came alongside. Look, really, you should have a safeguarding policy. It's important. Stops things going wrong, or when they do go wrong, there's a procedure that people can follow, and you really should do this. Would it be appropriate for the pastor whose church doesn't have a policy to say, oh, I feel like you're kind of judging me, like I'm not a proper Christian, or you're trying to condemn my ministry? It'd be totally inappropriate to make that about him. And yet this is happening all the time when it comes to the use of pictures or any other issue to do with pro-life. It's oh, what are you saying about me? Well, actually, I'm not saying anything about you. This isn't about you. This is about saving the babies. And so people actually resist bottoming out whether or not the pictures save lives, because they're more interested in defending their right to disagree and not be disapproved of, as if it's about that, when babies are dying. The problem is we're just not serious about ending this genocide, are we? Our heads are somewhere totally different. You know, the other side, they study how to kill babies more efficiently. They train one another in how to kill babies more efficiently. They offer financial incentives to centers to kill more babies. They campaign relentlessly to remove every barrier to killing babies. They do this politically when necessary. None of them shirk from getting political. If something works, if it kills more babies, they'll do it. They don't waste time with navel gazing and whining and whinging and saying to each other, oh, please don't think I'm not as devoted to the cause as you are just because I don't agree with your particular method. They get on with the job. They do it. And that's why they're winning, and they have been winning for decades. And yet all this time, where have we been? Where are we? We're hiding in a wine press. Yet eager at the same time to make sure no one accuses us of not being pro-life just because we don't agree with a particular method, such as, I don't know, actually doing anything, doing something, ever. I can't tell you the number of men, full-grown men, Christian leaders, leaders of leaders, who within seconds of being engaged on the issue of the baby genocide, they start speaking as though they are the victims in that conversation. It's all about how they feel. It's all about what it's going to do to their ministry, their church, as if they're the victims, when every day hundreds of babies are being poisoned, dismembered. But no, these men say, what are you saying about me? Are you saying if I don't talk about it this Sunday, I'm not a proper Christian? I never said that. How is it keeps being made about us? We're nowhere near finding out and pursuing methods that actually work for saving babies because we're terrified of even having that conversation. We don't want answers. We want to keep hiding and justifying ourselves as if it's about us. We don't want there to be an answer. We want to keep pluralism wrapped around us like a protective cloak. The last thing we want to do is admit that there is an answer, but it entails making ourselves enemies of the cultural mainstream. So we pretend there isn't a way, and we become quite vicious against anyone who says there is a way, as if they're being vindictive against us, though it is almost certainly our consciences convicting us, because we know that this insanity doesn't hold water. There are, as it were, intellectual mistakes going on here. There are things we're just missing. I think there are category errors taking place the whole time. So, for example, the evangelical mind, such as there is in this country, is still very much in the 1500s, as if the big issue of the day is soteriology, and the big enemy of the day is legalism, as if preaching a gospel of works, salvation by works, as if that's the big enemy that constantly needs taking down. And sort of on the back of that, any clear statement that's made about we need to do this or we shouldn't do that or whatever, it's often interpreted in soteriological terms. So it's interpreted as, are you saying I'm not a real Christian if ... Because our heads are really in the soteriology sort of box. And so we misinterpret claims that are made all the time by, oh, are you saying, you wouldn't have communion with someone who thinks like this? Or are you saying it's, it's unforgivable for someone to do that? Well, no, we're just saying there are outworkings of the gospel. And we're not confusing the gospel with its outworkings, but there are outworkings of the gospel, and they matter. But a lot of the evangelical world on this side of the pond especially, is still very much stuck in the Reformation. Now, we needed the Reformation, and those issues still matter very much today. But when's the last time you heard a church in this country actually preaching salvation by works? Can you think of many or any churches where legalism really is the issue? and yet we keep acting as though it is. What if the greatest threat to authentic Christianity, though, in this country today is nothing to do with soteriology as such? It's not the threat of legalism, but in fact the threat of cowardice. What if it's our allergy to application? We don't want the outworkings of the gospel. There's an intellectual mistake as we miscategorize claims that are made. We think a soteriological point's being made, but it's just actually an ethical point. It's about how now we shall live. But even this mistake has, I would say, heart origins. You see, you don't get persecuted for privately believing in a gospel of faith by grace. You don't even really get persecuted for sharing that with others. If it's in quite a sort of personalized, pietistic form. You might get laughed at, but you're not going to get hated and really persecuted. But you do get hated and persecuted if you bring the outworkings of the gospel, the moral, ethical outworkings of the gospel, to bear, especially in the public square. John the Baptist didn't get persecuted for baptizing people, but he did get his head chopped off because he challenged Herod on his brother's wife. The outworkings of the gospel are real, and they are so often where the rubber hits the road in our culture today. Now, 1500s, yes, you would get your head chopped off or you'd be burned at the stake for making a claim to do with the authority of Scripture directly or the nature of salvation. But today, it's the anthropological and ethical outworkings. That's where the battles are. And yet many of us are acting as though the battles are not there. And I want to suggest that there's a heart reason for that. We would like to believe the battle line is still where it was in the 1500s. Why? Because it's actually quite easy to fight there. You don't really get persecuted. When you fight on the battle lines that are real, then where there actually is fighting going on, you get hurt. And so it shows one of the ways in which actually it's the heart that dictates to the mind. We see that in Romans chapter 1, that men considered it not worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, and so they suppress it, they worship created things, and they're given over to insanity. And so often it's our worship that then dictates our thinking. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and so of course the fear of man is the beginning of folly. And so what we so often see in the church as well is that our affections, what we love, what we fear, that's actually what creates the framework for our thinking. That's why we think things that don't make sense, that don't hold water. We even allow everyone to think mutually contradictory things, and we make the claim that all of those views are equally Christian, which is a nonsense. They can't be. Not only can they not be equally Christian, they can't be equally anything because they contradict each other. By any measure of logic and truth, they cannot be true. Not all of them. And yet we tolerate it. Why? Because it suits us. Because it helps us to stay out of persecution, we think. And so there is no Christian mind because there is no Christian heart. As I close, I want to just draw this together with two or three things in particular, which I think summarize the problem we have in the Christian heart. It's because we have no Christian heart that we have no Christian mind. First, to summarize, fragility. We have this fragility. We have this fragile self-esteem where we are very quick to take things personally, and we are desperate for other Christians to affirm us as real Christians. And we interpret any kind of challenge, any kind of ethical conclusion about the vaccine, about how we vote, about whatever, home education, who knows what it is, even if it's only an implied stance, even if it's not said out loud, just by being something a bit different from the mainstream. So many of us are interpreting that as a criticism and one that we can't bear, and so we fight against it. There is this fragility, this fragile self-esteem that is driving us to believe and say things that don't make sense, to defend ourselves, to keep those criticisms away from us. Okay, well, that's fine. That's good for you, but don't say that it has to be good for all of us. And this is ironic because, as I said, we're still kind of living in the 1500s to some degree, as if everything's about soteriology. And yet that wonderful gospel of grace by faith in Christ, that gospel provides us with the most wonderful basis for a solid, I don't want to use the word self-esteem because it's not self-esteem, it's how we esteem God and how God, in a sense, esteems us in Christ, and we've got the full righteousness of Christ wrapped around us, and the old man has gone, the new has come, and we are righteous in His sight. We've become the righteousness of God, and we've got a bright future, and all our sins are washed away, and we have the Spirit living in us, and in all things God works for the good of those who love Him. We've got the basis that should utterly remove that kind of fragility. We should be self-forgetful. We shouldn't take things personally. We should be so free to forget about what it says about me and my history or my reputation or my ministry or who knows what. If it helps to save babies and it's biblical, let's do it. It should be as simple as that. And the gospel provides that basis, and yet somehow we've lost sight of that. Somehow we've got this very fragile self-esteem such that we take things personally and we don't want to know about these challenges. So that's one thing, fragility. Secondly, I think it's distinct, is cowardice. Not just fear of what you're saying about me, but in the public square, fear of what they're going to do to me. I don't want to be hurt. Don't hurt me. Don't persecute me. That cowardice stops us even pursuing how now shall we live, in public especially. So there's fragility and there's cowardice. And then finally, I want to close with this. There's a naivety. And this is a mixture, really, of intellectual mistakes and I think the heart issues that perhaps generate those mistakes. But there's a naivety. When Starmer gave his first speech outside 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, he claimed that he was unburdened by doctrine. Unburdened by doctrine. That was this Labour Party, unburdened by doctrine. Of course, that's a nonsense. All of us have a doctrine. All of us have a worldview. All of us take moral positions. And yet his claim was, hey, no, I'm others are extreme. Others have doctrine, but I'm just here to help. I'm just here to do the job. I'm all about service. He wrote an article in Premier. There was an interview with him in Premier, in which he said, look, I need the help of the church. We are 100% aligned, the Labour Party and the Christian church. We've got all the same values. I need your help to rebuild the nation. And the tragedy is so many Christians fell for this. Indeed, we voted for him, so many of us. And whilst journalists were talking about this boring Starmer, boring his way to victory, the reality is boring Starmer beguiled us. We believed it. We believed that he's not this side or that side, or he's certainly not anti-Christian. He's compatible with Christianity. He's just here to help. He's all about service. And he's unburdened by doctrine, which is fantastic. That means it's neutral. Christians can jump on board. We think he's our friend. We think he's there to help. But the truth is, and Rhys Laverty wrote on this, I think, very compellingly, Starmer loathes people like us. He hates authentic Christianity. He really does. Look, we've talked about this in other episodes. I won't go over it again. Look at his history. Look at the position he's taken on abortion. Look at what he thinks about free speech. Look at what he thinks about conversion therapy. But it's not just about Starmer. It's not even just about the Labour government. They stand for the ascendant cultural hegemony. They are a symptom and a representative of our cultural moment. They present as nothing to write home about, not extreme, middle of the road, but they are aggressively anti-Christian. Our battle's not against flesh and blood, but it does take specific forms at specific times, and we need to be awake to what's going on today. So I want to close really with a word to naive Christians, if not cowardly Christians. Christians who think we can just vote any which way and we don't have to get involved in the cultural wars and let's just stay out of it and preach the gospel. The truth is the culture is coming for you. And if I can't convince you to stand up for the sake of the babies, for the sake of the elderly, for the sake of the disabled, for the sake of the Jews, can I at least convince you in the way of Mordecai reasoning with Esther? You know, Mordecai said to Esther, don't think you'll escape, when she was wavering and didn't want to stand up and approach the king about the genocide of the Jews. He said, look, don't think you'll escape. When she kind of realized, well, her neck was on the line as well, she took a view and said, well, if I perish, I perish. Can I at least convince you or encourage you to stand up for your own sake? To wake up for your own sake. The culture is coming for you. There will come a time, unless the Lord intervenes, when they will come for your private profession as well as your public confession. They'll come for your children. They'll come for your church. There will only be, and I would say in fact there already are, only two options: to obey or to resist this creeping tyranny. If leaders, if churches, if Christians continue in the willful delusion that all roads lead to Rome and a Christian can support this political trajectory or that one, regardless of what it does to babies and elderly and women and freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on, they will end up like the state churches of China, preaching a communist, patriotic version of the gospel that's heavily censored, heavily doctored. They'll kid themselves. They're just keeping the main thing, just preaching the gospel, not getting involved in politics. But the reality is politics is getting more and more involved in them and perverting their gospel. You may say you don't do politics, but politics does you. And it's going to do you more and more aggressively unless you wake up. Now is the time to wake up. I want to close with a quote from Niemöller, very famous quote. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Christians, can we stop quoting this and start paying attention to it? Can we recover, with God's help, our Christian heart, our courage? And then maybe we can recover our Christian mind and stop presenting this weak, contradictory, chaotic witness to the world. And then perhaps once we've recovered our Christian mind, we can act with integrity and with impact to the glory of God and for the blessing of our nation.